We're expecting the Prime Minister to answer a question during Prime Minister's questions, and she duly did, and it was important for the families to hear the Prime Minister's answer to Norman Lamb MP's question. And that has been followed, as you can see on your own screen, by a statement by the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. And again, I felt it was important for the panel members to be there with the families as they heard what the Secretary of State had to say. On behalf of Bishop Foster, welcome to Portsmouth Cathedral, and on behalf of the Gosport panel, welcome to this Beckett Hall for this important press conference. What I'd like to do is to introduce members of the panel. I'm going to go to the end. It's John Pansford, consultant geriatrician, Deborah Sturdy, Professor of Nursing, Duncan Jarrett, Police Commander, Kate Blackwell, QC, Dr. Bill Kirkup, Medical Director, Christine Gifford, who is a data access expert, and next to Christine is Professor Jim Smith, Professor of Pharmacology, and next to him David Henke, who's an investigative journalist. If I could just make a few opening remarks, because I know that you've had the report and been able to look at it and at the summary. With the publishing of this report and the disclosure of the documents and the accompanying publication of an online archive, which has now gone live, an archive of 140,000 documents, the panel has today delivered its terms of reference. These terms of reference embody the principle of putting the relatives of those treated at the Gosport War Memorial Hospital at the centre of the panel's review. For example, the panel was required, quote, to manage the process of public disclosure, initially to the affected families, unquote. I know that as journalists you would have found that frustrating and that we had to keep to our promise to report to them first. But thank you very much for not putting undue pressure on us and for respecting that. This morning and in private, which we deem to be the right way, within this cathedral, we have told the families what, from its examination of all available documents, we have found to have happened at the hospital. You've seen the panel's report. You therefore have seen, in particular, chapters 2 and 3 and table 1 at the back of the report, and that the documents reveal an institutionalised practice of shortening of lives through the use of opioids, the wrong use of opioids, not medically justified. The panel has had unique and privileged access to the hospital records of over 1,500 patients. These records demonstrate that 456 patients died through this excessive and wrong use of opioids. Taking into account the missing records, there were probably at least another 200 patients whose lives were shortened as a direct result of the pattern of prescribing and administering opioids that had become the norm at the hospital during that period. The panel's report explains what the documents reveal about the role of the clinical assistant, about the consultants, the nursing staff, and the hospital management. It is not for the panel to ascribe criminal or civil liabilities which are beyond our terms of reference. We have interrogated documents. Unlike an inquiry, we have not interviewed those named in the documents. It will be for any future judicial processes to determine whatever culpability and criticism might then be forthcoming. Like me, you will have heard the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care saying in the House of Commons, and it is clear that action will now need to be taken in response to what the panel has found. Like the panel, together with the families, you and the general public will ask, how could the practice of administering opioids in this way continue and not be stopped by the health system and by the various police, regulatory and inquest processes which were put in place? Part 2 of the panel's report shows how those processes unfolded and how, as a consequence, the families were failed. Within the panel's report, Chapter 9 explains the prominent part played by the national and, in particular, the local print and broadcast media here in Portsmouth. The documents show that media reports played an important part in encouraging people to come forward and to speak and highlight the patterns of prescribing and administering drugs, which had become, as the report shows, the institutionalised practice. What happened at Gosport War Memorial Hospital would not have been revealed without the tenacity and fortitude shown by the affected families. The process of disclosure to those families here this morning was private and emotional. I should say only that those families now face a further challenge of absorbing what the documents have revealed. They deserve everyone's support in so doing, and I would ask you, the media, who have often been their advocates, to be sensitive to their circumstances today. In conclusion, I should like to thank them for their patience in waiting for the panel's report and tell you that they received the report this morning with the same spirit of tenacity and fortitude that they have shown over the last 20 years. I'm very happy now to take questions to me and to my colleagues. Please.
Ian was from Sky News. You've chosen your words very carefully in talking about an institutionalised practice of shortening of lives. Were these people killed? And given your connection with the Hillsborough inquiry, what parallels would you draw between these two investigations?
I've made very clear in my statement this morning, just repeated, that it is not for the panel to ascribe criminal or civil liabilities. And to do so would be beyond our terms of reference. What we're called upon to do is to find the documents and tell the story from the documents. It will be for others to make their own judgment. And given what the Secretary of State has said today in the House of Commons, where he is flagging up the need for further investigation, it's incumbent upon me at this moment to be very circumspect about the words that I use. And so although I know it seems to block your question, I want to reiterate that it is not for us to ascribe criminal and civil liability. Your very good question about the Hillsborough families. There, of course, are huge differences, but there is, of course, one common theme. And the Prime Minister, when she was Home Secretary, asked me to write a report on lessons learned from the Hillsborough families. And the title of that report was The Patronising Disposition of Unaccountable Power. That is what the Hillsborough families had to struggle with over the years. And I don't want to put words into the mouths of the Gosport families, but I think from what the panel has seen in the documentation, that would be a fair description of what they too have had to contend with.
Was it recovered?
In our report, we found no evidence in the documents that there was any collusion. But certainly, the authorities appeared from the documents to put their own interest, their own reputation, above the interests of those who are asking the questions. And that, too, is a feature very similar with the Hillsborough narrative. Please.
So my question, the question is just one tiny factual point. You talk about the first warnings being in 1991 from 3 nurses. You do refer to some concern being expressed in 1988 in a document which is held by the Department of Health, but you don't highlight that in your findings. What was the nature of that document?
I'll ask Christine, who was responsible for the data access.
Well, you'll actually, if you have a look at the website, you'll see all of the documents there. I think the 1998 document was not very specific, and it didn't actually highlight an area of concern that would come forward. The 1991 dossier from the nurses was very, very, very different.
Bill, do you want to add to that?
No, I think Christine said it all. Thank you.
Can I just add one to the previous question? I understand you don't want to ascribe criminality, but institutionalised practice of shortening lives, that seems as if it sounds like a deliberate policy of administering these drugs with the knowledge that it could lead to somebody's life being terminated prematurely.
The word institutionalised is deliberate because what it demonstrates is the failure of the institution. So that there was, as you'll see in the report, a clinical assistant who oversaw the prescriptions for 12 years. This clinical assistant, her practice was known to the consultants who did not check and stop what she was doing. The nurses who had a responsibility, a duty of care to the patients, knew the doses that they were being asked to administer, and they too could have challenged the doctor, but didn't, and carried on administering. The pharmacist who was responsible for providing those opioids did not seek to restrain their use. And when some nurses did complain in 1991 to the institution, to the hospital senior managers, they were not heeded. And so it was the institution, as well as individuals, who it would seem to us were furthering this practice. And that's why we call it an institutionalised practice.
The practice of administering drugs knowing they would result in that outcome.
The nurses would know what they were being asked to administer, and the nurses would be seeing the effect. And as we show in the report, I think it's 59% of those who were given the diamorphine were dead within 2 days, and I think 71% of those who were given diamorphine with midazolam and hyoscine were also dead within 2 days. So the doctors and the clinical assistant and the nurses were aware of the effect of the doses that they were administering. And that's why we describe it as an institutionalised practice. Bill, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think given the patterns of prescribing and administration of the drugs in question that we set out in the report, there are 6 different separate criticisms of the policy that they were following. It would be beyond belief, I think, that anybody could not have understood the implications of those errors in prescribing and administration.
Yes, please, and then at the back. Yeah. Yes.
Katie Rasmussen, BBC Newsnight. I just wondered whether you've got a sense of why. I mean, if this was happening and it's institutional and everybody knows about it, or almost everybody, did you get a sense that this was because these patients were viewed as expendable, that they needed their beds more quickly? And what was the reason why an entire hospital, well, these wards, everybody would be thinking this was an all right way to behave?
I understand the need to ask that question, but the difference between an independent panel such as ours and a public inquiry under the 2005 Inquiries Act is that we simply interrogated the documents and we did not interview people. So questions about motive are beyond the terms of reference for the panel. But those are questions that will need to be prosecuted. At the back.
Yes, David Fenton from BBC Television. I'd just like to pick up on what Hugh Pym was asking and just reiterate, these were deliberate acts by members of staff who knew their patients were likely to die as a result or were at a great risk of dying as a result of what they did as individuals. Is that correct?
The documents show that, and if you look at Table 1 at the back of the report, you will see the analysis of those patients and the reason they were admitted and the medication that they were given and the doses. And you will see the judgment in the last column about whether or not these were clinically justified. But what those people you have in mind have not had the chance to do is to answer those particular documents. And therefore, that's why the panel has to be cautious about not going beyond its terms of reference. But it is clear to us that those doses were not clinically justified. So my colleagues, the clinicians on the panel, have analysed all these cases and have been able to say that it wasn't justified to prescribe and administer that particular dose of that particular medication for that particular condition. And that's as far as we can go.
So the issue of whether the people that were doing this, prescribing the drugs and physically giving the drugs, whether they knew in all probability what the result was going to be, that's not something that you can come out and say, yes, they did, or no, they didn't know.
That's an excellent question that needs to be put to the people, but it was beyond our terms of reference to do that. We were simply tasked with finding all the documents. Yes, please.
Rosie Taylor from The Telegraph. I know that you've just explained that you weren't responsible for finding motivation, but it does appear that there's some evidence within the report of documents you've seen where people have discussed motivations. For example, the report from Pauline Spilker, which seems to imply that a patient talked himself into being given a syringe driver. Did you find any of that sort of evidence that suggested maybe patients were being given drugs if they were being particularly problematic?
What we found is that generally there was a lack of consultation with patients and their families.
I don't know whether I've missed this, but in your appendix at the back where you list the people you asked for documents and who responded, I couldn't see Dr. Jane Barton's name mentioned. Did you request documentary evidence from her and did she respond?
Let me get Christine to answer that particular question.
Yes, we did ask, and yes, she did respond.
Thank you. Please.
Sarah Bosley from The Guardian newspaper. Is this a one-off? Is this a historical event, tragic and appalling, and lessons have to be learned about how to talk to families? But could something like this happen in another hospital, or more particularly, perhaps today, a nursing home?
That, again, was beyond the terms of reference. We were asked to look at a specific hospital and not to extend our inquiry beyond Gosport. But it is a perfectly legitimate question, and I have to say that even this morning I've received an email through my own website with somebody alleging that this has happened in another hospital to a relative of them. So I think it does raise the question, but again, the panel is not competent to answer what the extent of this may be throughout the country. But we certainly do make the point, and I made it this morning to the families, that when their questions were being dismissed and when the refusal came that there would be no public inquiry, and the reason given was that this was not of national significance, the panel does beg to differ. And certainly, the Secretary of State this morning was saying the Department of Health will need to review all sorts of areas, and this may well be. But I'm speaking now as an individual rather than as a panel member with the authority to say any more. Please.
I'm Nicholas Carding from the Health Service Journal. I just wondered if I could get the panel's views on what priorities or actions should be in the...
Sorry about that.
That's all right. Yes, just wondered if you could give some...
I'm sure it's nothing to do with your question.
Well, hopefully not.
It certainly wasn't triggered by me.
Just wondered if I could get your views on what priorities or actions should be in the minds of the people that run our hospitals and trusts today in relation to the findings of the report.
Yes, again, each of us on the panel will have a view about that as individual people, but I have to stress it is beyond our terms of reference. So I couldn't say the panel now recommends, because we together have not discussed it. We've not had time to discuss it. We've been taken up with the task in hand. But I think those questions do need to be asked. And certainly the debate that we left, which is still going on, those were the sorts of things that were being raised. And I know the families would want those questions raised by other people, but again, it's not for us to do that. But I could say, speaking for myself, I'm sure my colleagues might agree, is that if we were asked for any future consultation process, we would be very willing to participate in such a consultation, because doing this work has given us an insight into a particular hospital acting in a particular way.
Charlotte Morgan from LBC. You mentioned that there was an absence, that you estimate that there could be a further 200 deaths on top of the figure. And you mentioned that that estimate is based on the absence of patient records. Forgive me if it says this in the report. Maybe I've not quite got to it. But what is the reason for the absence of those records? Is there any suggestion that they might have been destroyed in any way?
I'll ask Bill to refer to that. Some were missing, some were incomplete.
Thank you. Yes, after the sort of length of time that we're talking about, from 1987 to 2016 or so, it might actually be surprising that we found as many as we did. Hospital records have a natural destruction date on them, and unless there's a good reason to keep them, they can be destroyed after a certain period. We found over 1,500 out of 2,024 that we looked for. Of those, about 1,100 were usable because they had all of the relevant information on that we needed to look at to make an assessment. The others, there were records there, but they were missing important bits, and so we couldn't come to a conclusion about them.
Thank you. If there are... Oh, sorry. Beg your pardon.
Sue Courtney, Gosport War here, representative for Gosport. Thank you very much for your report and all your hard work. Do you have any evidence to reassure residents of Gosport who now are still using the Gosport War Memorial Hospital that practices are safer there now?
I'm glad you've asked that question, because we are dealing with concerns related to historic cases and not to the present day. And again, we have no authority to comment on the quality of care, but this is very much an historic investigation. But we have visited the hospital, the panel, and we were received very warmly, and it was very good to be able to move around the hospital freely and to ask questions, and there was no resistance whatsoever. Quite the contrary, a great willingness to work together with the panel. Is somebody come in with the questions?
Tim Atkinson, BBC Radio Solent. You've talked a lot in the last few minutes about your remit, but you've also talked about families being at the heart of this, of your investigations. Do you feel you've been able to give the family what they need, what they want?
Shortly, you'll be able to meet with whichever families are willing to speak with you. But without putting words into their mouth, they were enormously appreciative of what the report has said. They had a presentation from me, and then they were given, each person was given a copy of the report, which they were able to begin to read. As you'll appreciate, it's very detailed. Their reaction, as I said at the beginning, was understandably emotional. And I think the way they reacted showed them just how much they had carried inside themselves over 20 years or so. And if I can quote anonymously one of the families as saying to me that it was such a relief to hear what they had thought for so long and been dismissed, to hear their narrative understood and repeated by a panel that had done such detailed research into the documents. And again, I want to emphasize the distinctiveness of the panel was that we had access to all, as Bill has said, 2024, and all those documents, and no other investigation either sought or had such access to that comprehensive set of documents, which gives, I think, the panel the authority with which it has spoken today. Yes, whispering in my ear is the QC who served on the panel. I just asked Kate to add a word to that.
Yes, one family member made that point to me this morning and said that, in fact, for her, this was the beginning. 20 years or so too late, but eventually they were being recognised and the fault at the hospital was being recognised. And they are confident that today's report is the start of the process that should have taken place a long time ago.
And you asked earlier about parallels with the Hillsborough Independent Panel. I know that for some of the families who've spoken with me honestly, they said that it was only with that panel report that they felt that they began to grieve, some over 25 years later. And I think this is true of the Gosport families. There were lots of tears this morning. There were people grieving. And a word that I think people should be extremely cautious about is closure. I wrote about this in the preface to my report on the patronising disposition of unaccountable power, saying that, there is no closure to love, no closure to the love you've had for somebody you've lost, and added that grief actually is a journey without destination, and you continue to travel through it. And when you meet the families today and interview them personally, I think you'll probably hear and see that it's, even though these things happened some 20 years ago, that it is a journey without destination for them too. It looks as if we're coming to the end of the debate, and I need to return to the families for a question and answer session with them now that they've heard the statement and also had a chance to look at the report. But I'll take one more question, please.
And obviously, I just wondered why really you decided to include that. I mean, people will see that included and perhaps maybe start to draw, comparisons. Just why was it that that was included, and in what ways does that sort of help this, you know, what you're trying to get to the bottom of here?
Yes, that's a good question. And again, I go back to our terms of reference, that we interrogate documents, and what we found was that Harold Shipman was mentioned in some of these documents. But when you get the chance to read the report in detail, you will see that we do draw a distinction, because Harold Shipman acted alone, apparently, whereas what we're describing to you in this report is an institutionalised practice. And that's a significant difference. But I take your point. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, if that's all the questions, I'd really now like to get back to the family so that we can have a question and answer session with them, and then I believe they'll be available to you for interview.
Everyone has already asked why. You said it so well.